Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. On this show, I try to do something quite simple. I step back from the noise, I look at what's happening in the world, this slightly wild ride we all seem to be strapped into at the moment, and I ask a basic question. Is this really unprecedented, as some journalists would have us believe, or has all this happened before? Because 9 times out of 10, it's happened before. Last week, you may have seen that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was arrested in the UK. And let's be clear, because I think it really matters. In law, he's actually innocent until proven guilty. That's how the system works, and that's how this must work. We've got to see the process through. What caught my attention, though, was not simply the arrest, it was the coverage. Headlines around the world confidently declared that this was the first time in 350 years that a member of the British royal family had been arrested. 3.5 centuries, they said, not since the arrest, trial, and execution of Charles I. It's an amazing line. It's a wonderful line. It's dramatic, it's clean, it's neat, but it's also not true. After Charles I lost his head, the Stuart story didn't politely end. His grandson, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, then led a rebellion against his uncle. He was arrested, he was tried, and he was executed in 1685 after the failed Monmouth rebellion. Arrested, tried, and executed. And of course, then there's William IV. Long before he became king, as a young naval officer, he was actually briefly arrested in a brawl in Gibraltar. Not quite the same levels of drama, I grant you, but an arrest nonetheless. So the idea that the royal family has gone 3.5 centuries without anyone being arrested simply doesn't hold up. And I think this is why context matters. We're constantly told that we're living through uniquely shocking times, that institutions are collapsing in ways never seen before, that everything is actually without precedent. History, I think, tends to smile at that, because history has seen rebellions, scandals, arrests, executions, brawls, cover-ups, and family dramas that make modern headlines look almost tame. So yes, I appear to be on something of a one-man mission to gently correct the world's media when they tidy history into something that sounds good, travels well, and fits neatly into a headline. But it's not quite accurate. And since everyone suddenly seems to be talking about Charles I, it felt like the right moment to bring this episode back from the archive, because I did talk about him way back when. And if we're going to invoke 1649 every time there is a royal scandal, then we should at least understand exactly what happened way back then. So let me set the scene. It was a bitterly cold day in January 1649. Whitehall is tense, the air feels heavy. Charles Stuart, King of England, Scotland and Ireland, steps out of the Banqueting House, a building he himself commissioned, a magnificent, almost theatrical space, all grandeur and divine right painted across its ceiling. And then he does something no reigning monarch had ever done before. He walks out of a window. Not metaphorically, literally. A scaffold has been erected outside in the street at Whitehall, in front of a waiting London crowd. This is no battlefield death, no assassination in the dark, no dagger from a rival claimant. This is public, it's deliberate, and it's judicial. Charles kneels, he places his head on the block, and a reigning king is beheaded. For the first time in world history, a sitting monarch has been put on trial by his own subjects and executed following a court's judgment. It absolutely stunned those who saw it. It stunned Europe, and it has echoed through British history ever since. But here's the crucial thing. It didn't just happen overnight. Kings are not dragged to scaffolds on a whim. This was the culmination of years of tension, civil war, religious upheaval, political fracture. England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales pulled into a maelstrom of competing visions about power and parliament, faith, and the very nature of monarchy. It was revolutionary. It was the only time Britain has ever become a republic. For a brief, extraordinary period, there was no king. The old order was gone. So, how does a kingdom cross the psychological line from criticizing a king to actually trying him, and from trying him to actually executing him? Because while many kings across history have been killed, by Vikings on battlefields, by ambitious relatives, never before had one been condemned in a courtroom by his own people. That truly was unprecedented. So settle in, folks, and I'll take you on a drive. This is a deep dive into the only trial and execution of a reigning British monarch, and it remains a story with the power to unsettle. So what on earth put King Charles I in a prison cell and then on the execution block? How did we get from a crowned, anointed monarch to that cold January morning in 1649? Like all traumatic political ruptures, this has very long roots. You can start in 1649 if you like, but you will understand almost nothing. You have to wind the clock back. Charles comes to the throne in 1625. Almost immediately, he falls out with Parliament, and not in some minor grumbling way. The disagreement is fundamental. It's about money. It's about religion. It's about power. It's about who is actually in charge of the kingdom. Eventually, he decides he has had enough of them and rules without Parliament for 11 years. And it's a period that we actually call the personal rule. But ruling without Parliament creates a structural problem. Kings still need money. Armies cost money. Wars cost money. The government costs money. So in 1640, Charles is forced to call Parliament again because he needs funds. He's almost broke. And within 2 years, what has already a strained relationship has completely collapsed. By 1642, it has deteriorated so badly that civil war breaks out between king and Parliament. Now, and this matters, almost nobody enters that first civil war thinking, right, let's cut his head off. That's not the aim. The aim for most of the parliamentary side is to force the king to reform, to rein in what they see as his worst excesses, to reach some kind of constitutional settlement, to compel him, in effect, really, to govern differently. And that's a very different thing from regicide. But war doesn't go well for Charles. Parliament wins. He ends up effectively a prisoner. And by the late 1640s, a critical question begins to surface. What do we do with this man? Because by 1648, after a second round of fighting, the Second Civil War, Parliament's forces have crushed Charles again, most decisively at the Battle of Preston. He's already in captivity, and many now believe he has demonstrated that he can't be trusted. He negotiates, he promises, and of course then he maneuvers behind the scenes, again and again. So they arrive at a genuine crisis. There is one faction, particularly within the new model army, that has reached the end of its patience. For them, enough is enough. This man is treacherous. He lies consistently. He will never accept limits on his power. Restore him, and he will simply begin again. Another war, another negotiation conducted in bad faith. He must be brought to justice. And then there is the other faction, largely within Parliament, I have to say, which can't quite imagine England without a king. They still hope for a settlement. They still believe some form of compromise is actually possible. By this point, this is no longer simply a king versus parliament. The army has actually become a political force in its own right. The coalition that defeated the king begins to fracture. Those who fought side by side now disagree profoundly about what victory actually means. Parliament hesitates, the army grows impatient. And underlying all of it is one brutal question. Can you ever truly trust a king who believes his authority comes directly from God? By late 1648, for enough men within the army, the answer is absolutely no. And once you reach that conclusion, the unthinkable begins slowly to become thinkable. You can see the fault lines widening. The coalition that once fought together is now pulling apart. Parliament on one side, the army on the other. That polarization is what ultimately makes the trial of Charles I possible. But then comes the practical problem. How do you try a king? Who has the authority to summon him? Who sits in judgment? Under what law? And if he is found guilty, guilty of what exactly? None of this sits comfortably within the legal framework of the time. Civil war itself is not legal in any tidy sense, yet there is a very real determination, both in Parliament and in the army, to make this process appear lawful. They don't want to look like rebels staging a coup. They want legitimacy. And here lies the fundamental difficulty. In 17th century political thinking, justice flows from the king. The king is sovereign. The king summons parliament. The king stands at the head of the legal system. Treason, by definition, is a crime against the sovereign. But if the king is the sovereign, how can he commit treason? It's a legal knot of the highest order. So in early December 1648, the army intervenes directly in what we now call Pride's Purge. Soldiers stand at the doors of Parliament and block entry to MPs known to favour a settlement with the king. Some are turned away, some are arrested. And if you are prepared to strike a deal with Charles, you are no longer part of Parliament. What remains is a reduced body composed of those willing to contemplate a trial, or at least not prepared to prevent one. The political obstacle is now removed. The legal problem is now what remains. And this is where the argument turns genuinely revolutionary. The traditional understanding of sovereignty is inverted. Instead of residing in the king, sovereignty is said to reside in the people. Parliament represents the people. The king forms part of the governing structure, yes, but he's not above it. He holds his position through the people and can therefore be called to account by them. It's a very complicated argument. Philosophically, I think very bold. Legally, I think very inventive. But for enough men at the time, it's actually persuasive. And that is how they reach the point where they can accuse a reigning monarch of treason against his own people. This is one of those really extraordinary moments in British history that somehow doesn't receive the attention it deserves. The idea that sovereignty lies with the people, well, that sounds really modern to us. Almost 18th century. Almost, I have to say, American. Yet here it is, in 1649, being tested in the most dramatic way imaginable. It's not expressed in soaring declarations of universal rights. It's pragmatic. It's also very urgent, born of war, and, most importantly, of mistrust. But it is revolutionary nonetheless. And once you accept that the people are sovereign and that the king can betray them, the scaffold outside the Banqueting House begins to look less like madness and more like consequence. And it really is revolutionary. Up to this point, kings and queens rule by divine right. And Charles absolutely believes in that doctrine. He is, in many ways, a divine right monarch par excellence. In his mind, the crown is not just a job, it's not a contract, it's actually a sacred trust handed to him by God, which means it's not open to negotiation, not with Parliament, not with generals, not with anyone. So when Parliament and increasingly elements within the army begin arguing that sovereignty lies with the people, The king can be called to account. He can be judged. They are not simply adjusting constitutional arrangements. They are overturning the entire theory of government. And I think it's reasonable to ask why this moment is not remembered as the revolution that it was. And I think part of that answer lies in 1660. The monarchy is restored, Charles II returns. There is, in effect, a collective desire to steady the ship and dampen down the memory of just how radical events had become. The Republican experiment is gently folded away, and the narrative softens. But during those months in 1648 and 1649, men are genuinely reimagining how power works in the United Kingdom. And then comes another extraordinary moment. The House of Lords refuses to cooperate. Parliament must create legislation to establish a court capable of trying the king. There is urgency. There is anxiety. A bill is drafted. It passes through the Commons and it's sent to the House of Lords. And the Lords refuse it. They don't accept that this Parliament possesses the authority to try a sovereign. They decline to approve the measure. So the Commons responds in a way that would have been unthinkable only months earlier. They effectively say, very well, then we don't require you either. It's a breathtaking assertion. The House of Lords is sidelined. The Commons declare that it alone holds the authority to act as the supreme power in the land. Later, the Lords will be formally abolished, but at this moment, they are simply brushed aside. And I think what's interesting is that we often speak of constitutional confrontations in 1911, for example, of Lloyd George and the Parliament Act, or of the struggle between the Commons and the Lords. Yet here, in the 17th century, we see something even more dramatic, the Commons asserting itself as the sole governing authority. This was the first time it had ever happened. So that made me then think, what of the court itself? Who actually sits in judgment? Where does the trial occur? And they chose Westminster Hall. The choice, I think, is very deliberate. Westminster Hall is not merely large and impressive. Essentially, it has housed the central courts of English justice. It carries enormous legal memory. Some of the most famous treason trials in English history have taken place there. William Wallace, Thomas More, Guy Fawkes. By holding the trial of Charles I in Westminster Hall, the organizers are making a statement. This isn't a backroom coup. This is not an improvised execution. It's a formal trial for treason. It's also large enough to accommodate a significant audience. Justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. Around 135 commissioners are appointed to sit in judgment. Not all attend consistently. The quorum required to proceed is technically just 20, but in practice, perhaps 50 or 60 are present during the entire principal sessions. Even that is extraordinary. Dozens of men sitting in a vast medieval hall, preparing to judge a king who believes he answers only to God. And if you pause and picture it, you can actually feel the strain in the room, because everyone understands that this is not merely a trial. It's a boundary that's about to be crossed. There is, however, a practical difficulty. A number of the most senior legal minds in the country quietly remove themselves from the scene. They actually retreat to the countryside. They make themselves scarce. They don't want their names attached to this enterprise. The keeper of the Great Seal, senior judges, leading legal officers, they grasp the risk. If this experiment collapses, they don't want to be remembered as having stood at its center. So Parliament looks further down the professional ladder. They appoint John Cook, an intelligent and capable barrister, though not one of the towering legal figures of the age. They also select John Bradshaw as president of the court. Bradshaw is also not a political titan. He's a relatively modest judge from Chester, but he is willing. And at this moment, willingness matters more than stature. And I think, as events would later show, some of these men would come to regret that willingness profoundly. But for now, however, the machinery is assembled. The stage is set. So let's have a look at Charles. He has been held in prison on the Isle of Wight at Carisbrooke Castle. Then he is moved to Hurst Castle, and eventually he's brought up to Windsor Castle while the court is being finalised. And at last we reach the 20th of January 1649, the first day of the trial. It's one of these brutal English winters. The Thames is frozen, the streets are hard with frost, food is scarce, London is cold, tense, and exhausted by years of war. Westminster Hall has been adapted for the occasion. The southern end is screened off so that the proceedings can take place within a controlled space. Soldiers line the hall. Galleries have been constructed along the sides. If you stand on the floor, you can't easily see the king. But from the galleries, you absolutely can. You have to imagine what the atmosphere was like, the noise, the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies, the anxiety, the excitement, the fear. This is not an ordinary court case. This is something that people will recount for the rest of their lives. And then Charles is brought in. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Altodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altodomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. He's dressed entirely in black, save for a blue ribbon and the garter star. And it's a very deliberate statement. Dignified, controlled, regal to the last. And then the trial begins. It's difficult, I think, not to wonder how differently this moment might sit in British memory had 1660 not occurred. Had there been no restoration, this day might actually stand at the very centre of British national mythology. The French always remember the execution of Louis XVI. They remember the storming of the Bastille. The Americans remember Philadelphia and the Constitutional Convention. If the public had endured, the 20th of January 1649 might have become Britain's defining revolutionary tableau. The moment the people asserted sovereignty, the moment a king was called to account, the birth of a republic. Instead, because the monarchy returned, memory is complicated. I think also mooted and slightly awkward. But in that freezing hall, with soldiers at the doors and a king in black standing before his judges, England was attempting something entirely new. And I think there's also something tragic in that. This extraordinary electric moment in British history tends to slip through our fingers. We know it happened. It sits in our textbooks. But do we sit with it? Do we actually feel how radical that moment was? I don't think we do. The Restoration in 1660 effectively folds it away and places it in a drawer marked awkward. And history as ever is shaped by those who prevail. When the monarchy returns, there is very little incentive to celebrate the moment when it was dismantled. We often picture Louis XVI on trial in France as the great rupture, the end of the old order, even though the Bourbons briefly returned. But this came first, and in many respects it was no less dramatic. So let's return to the 20th of January 1649. John Bradshaw rises as president of the court. The charges have not been easy to construct. They are accusing the king within a system that has always assumed the king stands above such accusation. Nevertheless, the indictment is read. Charles is charged with being a tyrant. He is charged with maliciously levying war against his own people. He is charged with attempting to bring in foreign forces to aid him. They have his correspondences, letters seeking assistance from overseas. He's also charged with renewing war in 1648. And that last point is actually critical. Many contemporaries interpreted the outcome of the First Civil War as divine judgment. Parliament's victory was, in their eyes, providential. Charles's defeat was actually God's verdict. So when war breaks out again in 1648, culminating in the Battle of Preston, it's seen by some not merely as political obstinacy, but as defiance of God's judgment. And then there is another charge, strikingly modern in tone, that he placed his own interests above the safety and welfare of his subjects. It's a charge that would resonate in almost any century. But of course, now we reach the crux. Charles listens, and then he refuses. He refuses to recognize the legitimacy of the court. He denies that it has jurisdiction over him. If he refuses to acknowledge its authority, then in his mind, it can't try him. He will not plead. He will not engage with the substance of the charges. To do so would to be accept that he can be judged by it. So then what happens? Well, very little on that first day. He can't be compelled to plead in the normal way because he simply denies that the court exists as a lawful body. The proceedings stall and he's dismissed. He doesn't rage, he doesn't shout. This is not theatre in that sense. Charles is actually very controlled. He's reserved. He's almost icy. Interestingly, when he does speak during the trial, he appears to lose the stammer that has marked much of his life. But overall, he remains completely composed. He simply holds the line. I am your king. You have no authority over me. And that calm refusal only heightens the tension. Because at that moment, two incompatible visions of sovereignty are standing face to face in Westminster Hall, and neither is prepared to yield. And this is where matters become extremely delicate. Charles's refusal to plead is not merely defiance, it creates a procedural crisis. If this is to look like a proper legal trial, it actually requires a defendant who acknowledges the court. It requires charges, evidence, and argument, a recognizable process. If the king will not plead, then the case cannot unfold in the normal way. Witnesses cannot be examined publicly in the conventional manner. Due process cannot be demonstrated step by step. And of course, that matters enormously. Parliament and the army are desperate for legitimacy. They don't want this to resemble a military execution dressed in judicial robes. They want it to appear lawful. And of course, there is another complication. Under existing legal precedent, if a subject refuses to plead when brought to trial, that refusal can be taken as an admission. In effect, the person may be treated as guilty. So technically, at the end of the first day, they could have said, well, very well, you refused to plead, and therefore you're guilty, and they could have then proceeded directly to sentence. But politically, that would have been an absolute disaster. It would have confirmed every suspicion that the outcome was predetermined, that this was a sham, that legal forms were being manipulated to conceal a foregone conclusion. And of course, there's something deeper still at stake. If Charles were to acknowledge the court, even reluctantly, he would be acknowledging the authority of the body that created it. He would, by implication, be accepting that Parliament and the army together constituted a lawful government. And that's crucial. They want him to plead not simply so that they can try him. They want him to plead because his acceptance of the court would legitimize the new order. And Charles understands that perfectly. By refusing to recognize the court, he is actually refusing to recognize their authority. He's saying, in effect, you may hold me prisoner, you may surround me with soldiers, but you are not the lawful power in this kingdom. It matters profoundly that he will not bend. So, what's then their strategy? They press him, they hope he will reconsider. They hope that perhaps he might calculate that pleading, even pleading guilty in some limited form, could reopen the possibility of negotiation. Some have actually suggested that there were still those who believed an accommodation could be found, that if Charles acknowledged the legality of the court, some formula could be constructed, perhaps blame could be distributed, perhaps responsibility for the wars could be shared with advisors or commanders. And I think it's here that historians continue to debate. Was this going to end in execution? Was it, in truth, a show trial with the outcome fixed from the beginning? And I think the difficulty of answering that question is revealing. There were absolutely men involved who believed the king must die, that justice and perhaps safety required it. But there were others who were still holding the door slightly ajar, not entirely convinced that regicide was inevitable, that the trial was not a single will, it was a coalition, and the coalitions rarely move with one mind, which makes Charles's refusal all the more consequential. By standing firm, by declining to recognize the court, Charles steadily narrows the available options. With each refusal, the path away from execution becomes harder to find. And he's not passive in this process, far from it. He has had months to think about this on the Isle of Wight, at Hurst Castle, at Windsor. He actually understands perfectly well that where this could end. And on the second and third days of the trial, he does something genuinely astute. He reframes the argument. The prosecution accuses him of betraying his people, of waging war against them, of placing his own authority above their safety. Charles turns the accusation back upon them. By refusing to recognize the court, he argues, he is protecting the liberties of the English people. At one point, he states that if power without law can make laws, then no subject in England can be sure of his life or anything that he calls his own. I think that's a really, really sharp maneuver. He's actually presenting himself not as a tyrant, but as a safeguard against arbitrary power, specifically the arbitrary power of the army and a parliament that has been purged of dissent. Given his record with extra parliamentary taxation in the 1630s, the argument requires a certain boldness. But rhetorically, it is effective. He is asserting that he is not the threat to liberty, that they are. And this is a reminder, I think a stark reminder, that he's not intellectually overwhelmed. He actually understands precisely what's at stake. On the fourth day, the court doesn't sit in public. Instead, witnesses are heard in private, in the Painted Chamber at Westminster. And this actually matters. If the trial is to carry even the appearance of legality, it must rest on testimony. Individuals must be prepared to say, I was present, I saw this, I heard that. Oliver Cromwell, who has not yet dominated this narrative, but is very much present in the background, is keen that the process appears lawful. By the summer of 1648, he had likely concluded that Charles couldn't be trusted and must be brought to justice. Even so, he recognizes the importance of form. Witnesses are called, evidence is gathered, their statements will later be read aloud in open court. Then we reach day 5. The court reconvenes. The witnesses are read in the morning, but by the afternoon, there is nowhere left to go. Charles has repeatedly refused to recognize the court. He has refused to plead. There can be no conventional trial if the defendant will not engage. How many times can the court assemble, the charges be read, the king declare the proceedings unlawful, and the session be adjourned? So on the 5th day, they decide to move forward. Charles is declared guilty. It sounds abrupt. It feels abrupt in many ways, but in reality, the confrontation has been unfolding for years. Day 6 brings another pause. Practicalities absolutely must be settled. The sentence must be drafted. The language must be precise. This is no minor administrative detail. During this interval, something profoundly human occurs. Four of the king's closest friends approach those involved in the trial. They plead, they offer almost anything. Some even offer their own lives in exchange for his. And this is a reminder that behind the constitutional theory, legal argument, and political maneuvering, there are loyalties and friendships and personal grief. But the machinery by this stage has acquired way too much momentum, and it continues to move forward. At this stage, the offers become increasingly desperate. Massive amounts of money is offered, estates are offered, personal fortunes are offered, lives are offered in exchange for his, and all are refused. It's now abundantly clear to one and all that there will be no negotiated escape. They're not prepared to bargain with a king who will not acknowledge their authority. And the moment, I think, for compromise then passes. The sentence is formally announced on the 27th of January. Bradshaw enters dressed in red, the color of judgment. Everyone present understands what that signifies. This will not end in reprimand or exile. It will be final. He reads the sentence. Charles Stuart is to be executed by the taking off of his head. The king asks to speak. He reminds Charles that he has been brought there to answer charges made in the name of the people of England. At that moment, a voice cuts through the hall from the gallery, believed to be from Lady Fairfax, the wife of the army's commander-in-chief. She's swiftly removed. But that brief interruption reveals something essential. This is not a serene, unanimous revolution. It's a tense, contested, very fragile affair. The air in Westminster Hall is thick with uncertainty. Every single word matters. Bradshaw then delivers what amounts to be a constitutional declaration. He speaks of law, of accountability, of the king being subject to justice. He describes the bond between ruler and ruled as reciprocal. In effect, a contract. If that bond is broken, sovereignty dissolves. In another country, in another historical trajectory, that speech might have been foundational doctrine. Instead, it lingers on the margins of memory. Once the sentence is pronounced, something then curious happens in legal terms. Charles is now dead in law. He is still breathing, still standing, but legally he no longer exists as king. He's been declared a tyrant, a traitor, and a murderer. Charles attempts to speak again. The court again refuses to hear him. The moment for defiance, in their view, has well and truly passed. Judgment has been delivered. The machinery has done its work. And so we enter the final days. Sunday, 28th January, is the Sabbath. Under a regime shaped by Puritan conviction, that is not a trivial detail. No official business proceeds, and there is a pause. Charles actually spends the day with William Juxon, the former Bishop of London. And although that position has actually been dismantled, Juxon remains loyal. He offers what he can: prayer, presence, perhaps steadiness in the face of what now cannot be undone. What does a man do when he knows he will be executed within 48 hours? I suppose he would have prayed, he reflects, and he would have measured himself against eternity. On the 29th of January, Charles is moved to St. James's Palace. And I think it's a practical move and also a merciful one. At Whitehall, the scaffold is being constructed. Timber is being hauled, nails are being driven. It's a noisy affair, and the platform rises outside the Banqueting House. And I think he's moved so that he doesn't have to hear any of that. At Westminster, the death warrant is laid out. Commissioners are summoned to sign. Bradshaw signs first. Cromwell is among them. Names are added to a document that will then echo down through generations. Back with Charles, something profoundly human unfolds. His two youngest children are brought to see him: Princess Elizabeth, 13 years old, Prince Henry, 8. The machinery of revolution pauses briefly for a father and his children. And history, I think, for a moment, becomes unbearably intimate. We know what happened in that final meeting because Princess Elizabeth later wrote it down. In her small, careful hand, she recorded that her father told her that he had been faithful to her mother, that she must forgive those who had wronged him, that he went to his death as a martyr. To little Henry, who some had quietly speculated might be fashioned into a compliant puppet king, Charles gave a very different instruction. Never let yourself be made king. If you do, your older brothers, Charles and James, will be killed. Even now, he's thinking politically. Even now, he's calculating the consequences after his death. He says goodbye, he burns private papers, he distributes small keepsakes to his guards. The gestures are controlled and they're deliberate. Then the night closes in, and one imagines prayer, conversation with Juxon, long silences, while the machinery of revolution is finishing its formal work. Morning is coming. And I think what strikes me is the detail in what he actually chooses to wear. It's a bitterly, bitterly cold day. The Thames is frozen in places, the air bites. Charles puts on 2 shirts, not for warmth alone, but for appearance. He doesn't want to shiver on the scaffold and have the crowds mistake cold for fear. Whatever his political misjudgments might have been, he certainly wasn't physically timid. He had been present during campaigns. He understood risk. And here at the end, he's actually managing his final image. And of course, by now he knows exactly what is going on. And he's actually preparing himself for martyrdom. And in his mind, martyrs don't tremble. He arises early, probably around 5:30. Somehow he has actually managed to sleep. He dresses, he receives the sacrament from Juxon. He listens to the prayer book being read. He takes a very small breakfast of bread and wine. And I think the symbolism is impossible to miss. Bread and wine on the morning of his execution. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, he is escorted to St. James's Park. The air would have been sharp. Soldiers lined the route. And rumors would have rippled through the city. London would have been taut with expectation, part dread, part disbelief. And of course, he's then taken to Whitehall. And then comes a moment that feels almost, I think, theatrical in its staging. Charles walks down the long gallery. For those of you who know Whitehall, that detail really matters. The Long Gallery houses the treasures of his extraordinary collection. Charles wasn't a casual patron. He had assembled one of the finest art collections in Europe. On the morning he will lose his life, he passes the paintings he prized, the canvases he acquired with care and ambition. It's a very intimate image, because within hours he will actually be gone. Yet for these final moments, he moves through a space that's entirely his, curated by his taste, shaped by his authority. And at the end of that gallery waits a window, and beyond it, the scaffold. He passes portraits proclaiming his kingship, images of himself in armor and silk, the visual theater of divine right gazing back at him from the walls. And then he is taken not to some anonymous cell, but to his own room. Imagine the strangeness of that, to be placed back in your own chamber before being led out to die. The bed, the furnishings, the familiar geometry of a life lived in power. It's almost unbearably intimate. Parliament has actually discovered it has a problem. They have condemned a king, but they have not fully legislated for what follows. The moment the axe falls, Charles II automatically becomes king. The man can be executed, but monarchy as a concept doesn't evaporate with him. So the body dies, but the institution survives. And for a brief, frantic stretch of time, those who have engineered this moment scramble to prevent exactly that. An act is hurriedly passed, making it illegal to proclaim Charles II as king. The fuller constitutional architecture of the Republic will follow in the days ahead, but in that moment they are improvising the future while a condemned monarch waits in the next room. And that's extraordinary, when you pause over that thought. In one chamber, men are actually drafting the legal language of a new political order, and yet in the one exactly next door, the old order sits quietly, knowing his time is nearly up. Finally, at 2 o'clock, there is nowhere left to delay. The guards return, Charles is led from his chamber through the Banqueting House, and you can still stand there today. It was James I's great classical statement designed by Indigo Jones, a building that radiates authority. Above, Rubens's ceiling panels celebrate the divine right of kings, all rendered in incredible colors. And I think the irony is almost unbearable. The windows have been boarded up, the hall is crowded. Only one window remains open, with steps built up to it. Charles climbs those steps and passes through the window onto the scaffold erected outside. On the platform stand the executioners, masked. Guards, also masked. Bishop Juxon. And, remarkably, a handful of journalists. Even here, even now, the instinct to record is present. The power of the narrative hasn't been lost on anyone. And of course, when Charles looks out, he sees a dense line of buff-coated soldiers. Beyond them, a greater sea of people. London has actually come to witness something it has never, ever seen before. He is allowed to speak. This is the final opportunity to shape how he will be remembered. But the soldiers stand thick between him and the public. There will be no rescue, no dramatic reversal, so he speaks mainly to Juxon and those close enough to hear his words. He insists on his innocence. He concedes only one fault, that he has betrayed his friend Strafford years earlier, something he says has weighed heavily on him and heavily on his conscience. For that alone, he accepts blame. For everything else, he maintains that he has acted as a king according to his understanding of his duty. He repeats what he argued throughout the proceedings, that he would not submit to government by the sword. He forgives his enemies. He makes it explicit that he dies a Christian within the Church of England, pointedly dismissing the rumors of Catholic sympathy that had shadowed him for so many years. And then I think comes the line that absolutely endures. He says he goes from a corruptible crown to an incorruptible one. Earthly authority may be stripped from him, but a heavenly crown awaits. He then hands his garter jewel to Juxon and says simply, remember. Whether that means remember your king, remember this day, or carry this token to Charles II, we'll never know. But the word hangs in the winter air. He then tucks his hair beneath his cap so that his neck is clear. He kneels. He stretches out his hands as the signal, and the axe falls. And mercifully, it's a single clean blow. An eyewitness later writes that such a groan rose from the crowd as he had never heard before and never hoped to hear again. It wasn't a cheer, not triumph. It was something heavier. Shock, grief, a kind of collective recoil at what had just been done. And I think for a moment, time would have stalled. The Republic has executed a king. The men who orchestrated this believed that they were delivering justice, securing the state, preventing further war. And perhaps they were, but history has a habit of twisting outcomes. The very act meant to extinguish his authority actually begins to sanctify it. Within months, Charles will be memorialized in print and prayer. Within a decade, his son will actually sit on the throne, and the names of those who signed the death warrant will be hunted down. So when headlines reach for 1649 as shorthand for scandal or upheaval, it's worth remembering what the year actually contained. Not gossip, not embarrassment, but a kingdom crossing a line it had never crossed before, a courtroom declaring a king guilty, a scaffold outside a palace window, and the sound of a crowd realizing that the world it knew had shifted forever. If we're going to invoke that history, let at least understand its weight, because history does not repeat neatly, but it does remember. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.